So first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules. My name is Andrea. I'm with Inspira Advantage. I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion. And I know this is a really interesting topic that came highly requested. So we'll be talking about the day in the life of a med student and what that looks like. So before we get going further into tonight's presentation, just a couple of housekeeping rules, so to speak. First and foremost, this webinar is recorded. That's always the number one question we get, and you will receive a recording within your inbox in a day or two, so don't fret about that. In terms of how long we're looking at running tonight's discussion, we're looking at running it for about 45 minutes. We love to make this conversational. What that means is we encourage you to use the chat function. Ask those questions. No question is too big or too small. Alex is definitely an expert. He'll be introducing himself momentarily, but he has a lot to say and has so much value to provide you. So please do not hesitate. Get those questions in the chat. We'll have some time towards the end of the webinar, as well as we'll do a couple of check-in points with you guys to just see how you're feeling and get any of those questions answered. So what are we talking about tonight? What are we learning? Is Alex sharing with us? So we'll be speaking about a day in the life. He'll be speaking about study tips and staying on track, social life and relationships, mental health and resilience, memorable moments, and then just advice he has for all you future med students out there. Before I pass it off to Alex, just a quick introduction, because I recognize and realize that people on this call don't necessarily know who we are. So as mentioned, we're Inspira Advantage, we're a globally recognized admissions consulting and test prep firm with over 15 years of experience. We specialize in helping students gain admission to top graduate healthcare programs, including medical, residency, dental, veterinary, PA, and nursing school, with a 94% acceptance rate. We love what we do. So we believe in starting early, which is why we offer pre-health advising for college freshmen. Our team helps students build a tailored academic timeline, including course selection and GPA, find meaningful experiences like research, shadowing, clinical and non-clinical volunteering, extracurriculars, and of course, leadership roles. We also work on making their application stand out from the rest with a stellar personal statement and interview prep. These steps lay a strong foundation to differentiate applicants and really make that lasting impression. In addition, our tutors provide personalized one-on-one test prep for MCAT, DAT, and GRE tests. First and foremost, we do diagnostic tests. We then move on to custom study plans and interim progress tracking, seeing students' scores increase an average of 15 points on the MCAT with a 45+ hours of tutoring. Our 60-hour programs even include score guarantees of 515 for the MCAT, for example. When it's time to apply, our all-inclusive applicant program offers unlimited support through the entire application cycle. This includes crafting a personalized narrative and school list, perfecting personal statements and essays with unlimited edits, providing interview prep, scholarship guidance, and waitlist strategy. We're by our student side until they receive their acceptances. Our goal is very simple. It's to create the most competitive candidates and applications, ensuring our students shine in a competitive admissions landscape. If you're looking to learn more, we offer free personalized consultations via video, phone, or email. No matter where you are in the application process, we're here to help, we're here to support you, and we want to hear from you. With that being said, I'd love to pass it over to Alex. Here you go, to introduce himself, and we can get going with tonight's topics discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I'm a third-year medical student at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City. This photo is from one of my first days of rotations when I was just happy to be in scrubs and in the clinical setting for the first time. I'm super excited to talk to you guys about my experience in medical school so far, what to kind of expect, because I know applying is such a big, task that I think I often didn't really think about what happened afterwards. I just wanted to get in the first place. So I'm glad to give you guys more insight into what day in the life in medical school is, because it definitely varies based on what phase you're in and where you are in the curriculum in general.
Amazing. So let's get going. The big question, and I know this has a lot of nuances to it, but could you share what a typical day looks like for you as a med student, and maybe reflect on what a day in the life could look like for students at different levels and at different parts of the process?
Yeah, definitely. So for those unaware, there's typically three kind of parts to the medical school curriculum. The first 3 to 4 semesters, you're in the classroom, almost similar to college, where most of your curriculum is just all lecture based. And you do have small group work, and you may have some labs, like you have anatomy lab typically first year, and sometimes you have a neurology lab when you're doing your neurology section where you look at brain anatomy. But for the most part, you're just in the classroom. You're really not in the hospital at all, maybe for some shadowing. And a typical day in that situation would be typically you have classes in the morning every day. So typically from like 8 to 12. And at least at Cornell, everyone was in the same section. So everyone in your class, so like the entire first year class is taking the same lectures at the same time. And actually at my school, lectures were optional because they were recorded. So some students would not necessarily go to lecture, but they'd watch the lecture on their own time. Versus some students would go in lecture and watch it. So it really depends. But for me, what I would do is I would ideally make it to lecture typically and stay from 8 to 12. And then some people would study right after, almost treating school like a 9 to 5, like only doing their work during the daytime. And then in the evenings, take the rest of the day off. I know that was really common, especially with people who took many gap years and were used to like working and having that work-life balance. But since I had come straight from college, I think I was so used to studying in the evenings that often I had my afternoons free. And I live in New York, so I was able to like explore different neighborhoods, and I was able to actually have some free time in the afternoons. And then I would do my work in the evenings. Typically my weekends, I also would just plan to do some work in terms of preparing for upcoming exams or anything like that. Just typically we have the weekly quizzes that will kind of keep us on top of staying on top of the materials and stuff is optional. After that first, they call it the preclinical block where you're in the classroom. You spend 12 to 18 months in the hospital. So this is where you're on the wards, you're part of the clinical team, meeting patients. But also you do still have tests, which makes this part of the curriculum probably the most difficult. So typically what you would do, depending on the service you're on, because there's an array of different rotations that you are part of as a medical student, ranging from medicine to OBGYN to neurology to surgery. Depending on what time your team wants you to come in, it's usually between 5:30 and 6:30 they want you to come in to see the patient before rounds. And you would stay with your medical team until the end of the clinical day. So anywhere, if your residents are nice, they might let you out at like 3:30. But if they want you to stay the full day, it would be probably till 5:30. So it's probably like a 5:30 to 5:30 day. And then at the end of each of your clinical rotations, there is an exam that kind of tests you on the content that you're supposed to be learning while you're on the wards. So typically after you finish your rotation, you do have to study for 2 or 3 hours, I would say, ideally. So typically I would take a break from like maybe 5:30 to 6:30 and then do some work and like as much as I could. Some days you are just too tired and you just like want to relax the whole day. But ideally I would do work till like 9:30 and then go to bed so that I'm up early enough that I had a full night's sleep for like the next clinical day. And most services, you do only go in 5 days a week. On surgery and medicine, sometimes you go in 6 days a week, but it really is team dependent. And then the last phase of the curriculum, which is what I'm currently in, which is your last 3 semesters, is actually very research-based. Research is a major part of medical school in terms of conducting your own work, whether it's clinical research or bench lab research. And the nice thing is that depending on who you're working with, a lot of your schedule is kind of on your own. Like for me, I have certain meetings throughout the week that I have to attend and have progress updates for. But as long as I get my work done by those deadlines, I actually can make my own schedule. So typically right now, I am doing clinical research where I have to see patients Monday, Wednesday, Friday for the clinical days, like 9 to 4, and talk to patients. But aside from that, I have like 1 meeting on Thursdays and my weekends are completely free. So I just work on whatever other tasks I have to do for my project on when I have free time in the afternoons or evenings, but it's honestly not too many hours. And then my schedule is kind of my own, which is really nice. So it really does vary. Definitely your clinical year is the most difficult in terms of time restraints.
I'd love to just follow up on that. So,
Yeah.
because there's a lot to unpack there. And audience, we highly encourage you to use that chat. And if there's something you'd like Alex to elaborate on, or whatever the case is, we encourage you to use that chat. But I wanted to ask you, was there or is there any parts of your routine that you find especially challenging, or maybe even particularly rewarding, especially because there's so many moving parts to it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, the different phases makes medical school just go by very fast, honestly, because even though it's 4 years, you're always kind of doing something new, which is great. But I think something that is definitely challenging is when you're on your rotations, you are seeing patients all day and then you're kind of in the books at night, and it's just kind of a cycle that keeps going. The one, like, sometimes it is tough to like have a full day's work and then go back and typically you study through like question banks, which are like practice questions. And when you get like a lot of questions wrong in a row, like definitely morale could be low. But knowing that the next day you're seeing patients and you're working with them again definitely is like motivating to be like, let me just get through this day and then we could like get back to like clinical work tomorrow. I saw a question in the chat asking if I'm in an MD program. I'm not. I can speak a little bit to it just because I have friends in an MD PhD program. So typically MD PhDs, they spend the first 2 years with like the normal MD program. And then they kind of do their PhD, which takes 4 to 5 years, 4 to 6 years. And then they like come back and rejoin whatever MD, like a later MD class for the last 2 years. So their med school process is very similar, but their PhD is pretty unique to their program, if that's any help.
Absolutely. I'd love to move on to the next section, but I think our audience, I've hammered this enough. If they'd like us to go back to sort of the day in the life, we encourage them to get those questions in. Actually, before we do that, do you want to share a little bit about what these photos actually are?
Yeah, so this is the first one on the left again was early on in rotations, where your first 3 semesters in medical school, you're not seeing patients at all. Like, you're never wearing scrubs. You're just kind of studying, honestly, a lot of things that you studied in college in terms of like prep cycle and biochemistry and stuff. So I feel like in the mornings when I was rounding, I was just like, I felt so official to be like wearing scrubs, and you actually do check on patients before. You're typically the first person that wakes the patient in the morning, which honestly I found very rewarding because I felt like I had some kind of like purpose on the team for once. And then on the right is a robotic surgery that I was actually just like observing. Typically, since it's a robotic surgery, like you can't necessarily help much with it because it takes a lot of training to be able to use the surgical robots. However, they do let you close some of the port sites at the end of the surgery, which is pretty cool. So you do actually practice suturing and on real patients and things like that with surgeon guidance. So this was just kind of like a photo that was given to me of one of the robotic surgeries that I was a part of, which again, it's just very cool to be a part of cases, even if it's in a minimal setting, going from just studying and learning things theoretically to seeing them in the hospital.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's incredibly, incredibly unique. So I want to touch base on strategies for studying and staying on track, because obviously that's a big part of it. Do you want to share a little bit about some sort of maybe study techniques or resources that really helped you with that workload? Because obviously it's a very big difference between being in college and then transitioning into med school.
Yeah, so something that's really great about the transition to medical school is most med schools are transitioning to a pass-fail system for the first 3 semesters, or like that pre-clinicals part of the curriculum that I was talking about. So that really does help kind of blunt that transition, because the way I explain to my friends is you're definitely learning a lot more information, but the percent that you're expected to retain for an exam is smaller than in college. So like if in college you're expected to know 90 to 93% of the material to get an A, to pass, you need like 70 to 75% of the material. And on these quizzes or exams, whether you get a 75% or a 95%, there's actually no difference on your transcript. Of course, it's good to know 95% of the material just for your own knowledge, but I think it does help kind of blunt that stress of being in medical school. And I also think it helps you prepare for when you do have grades during the clinical portion of the curriculum. And I think key study strategies, honestly, I think the biggest thing universally is active recall. So definitely using a lot of question banks. For those studying for the MCAT, I'm sure that's a big part of your study plan in terms of using like the AAMC question banks. That's actually very similar to how you'll be studying for medical school. So that's definitely a big way to, rather than just like review textbooks or review your notes or review PowerPoint slides, doing questions that are similar to those that will be on your boards is the best way to study, in my opinion. So I saw a question about pass-fail strategy, help or hurt for USMLE. So this is kind of like a nuanced question. So there's 2 step exams or 2 USMLE exams you take during medical school. For those who don't know, step 1, which is kind of your basic sciences and very similar to the material you learned during this pass-fail part of your curriculum. Step 1 is actually also a pass-fail exam. So in a way, it kind of, I don't think it helps or hurts because that whole part of the curriculum is pass-fail. Versus step 2 is the graded exam. And you take that later on, you take that during your 3rd year. And by that point, you would have taken other graded exams. So I think if you're able to consistently score 90 to 95 and not overstress yourself, definitely go for it. But if you feel like you're becoming very overwhelmed with having that standard for yourself as you're transitioning into medical school, either from college or even if you haven't been in school for a while, I think just take advantage of the pass-fail and gradually honestly just compare yourself to yourself and always just try and do better than you previously did on past exams. And I think you'll find success. All right, so how would you recommend trying to learn the concepts instead of purely memorizing them? That's a great question. I mean, I do think being able to like teach back something to someone. So something that I've often done with friends is rather than just like knowing an answer because you just memorize it, explaining the rationale behind it, I think is really important. Especially with physiology, like everything, there's a reason behind everything in terms of like why the body works the way it does. So I think if you're able to explain that, that's really helpful. That being said, there are some things that are just purely memorization in terms of like what bacteria are covered by which antibiotics. Like there isn't actually a rhyme or reason. It just is kind of, it is what it is kind of. So I think there is definitely some memorization. And honestly, I think that's the harder part because there's no way to like rationalize your way through. It's just like you have to know it or you don't. Kind of like I'm sure for some of you have to know like protein structures for the MCAT. Like there's not like there is some kind of rhyme or reason, but it's not like valine is made this like for some reason. It's just like they call it valine. You need to know what it looks like. It's similar in that sense. So I think that stuff is actually sometimes the harder stuff to learn. But for physiology, where everything occurs for a reason, being able to explain that either to yourself on paper, like writing down your own explanation or explaining it to someone, I think is a great way to like learn the reason behind things.
I'd love to ask you, so how do you know where to focus your energy on first so you don't get bogged down by studying and all these expectations, even if it is pass fail?
Do you mean what like material to focus on?
Yeah, what materials? Yeah. How do you navigate that? Where do you start? How do you know where to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think thankfully the preclinical curriculum is kind of similar to college where you have each quiz has like a set number of lectures. So it really is just kind of knowing those lectures and doing the questions associated with them. Thankfully for the step exams, so the standardized exams and the exams associated with your rotation, there are a lot of practice exams. So you can actually see like, okay, what concepts are tested super often and things like that. So it's not like you're going in blind. You kind of have an idea like, okay, there'll be 5 questions on kidneys, 5 questions on cardio, etc. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It absolutely does.
Okay, perfect.
I was just going to read the question in the chat.
Yeah. So I see Miguel says, with the amount of material that you need to study for each class, is it easy to determine what pieces of information are high yield? Kind of similar to what I just said. When you get into the standardized exams, so the ones that go along with your rotations and the step exams, I think it is more easy because there are like hundreds of questions you go through, and there'll be certain things that you'll be like, oh, I've seen this so many times, which they're probably going to ask this. I think your first semester it could be tough. However, that being said, typically most medical schools give you, it's not like college where there's just like a midterm and a final. You actually do have exams like almost weekly or once every other week, which in some ways is annoying because it's an exam every week or every other week. But at the same time, that means it only covers 1 week to 2 weeks amount of material. So it's not like you're studying 100 lectures. Like I never have to know 100 lectures worth of material. It might be like 15 or 16, which is honestly similar to college. And you also like saw them all within the last 2 weeks. So it kind of is like a concentrated amount of time you're focused on something. So I think that made the exams in the beginning a bit more, not necessarily easy, but more like palatable, if that makes sense. All right, so I see. So does Cornell have high honors grading system? So how important? Okay. So for the pass-fail portion of the curriculum, which is the first 3 semesters, it's just pass-fail. So it's like if you get a 65 or above on your exams, you pass. If you don't, you fail. And you actually have an option to retake that part of the curriculum. It will be, I'm not sure how it's noted on your transcripts, but it's not like if you fail, you're just like out. Like there are ways to like rectify that. And then for rotations, there is honors, high honors, pass, and fail. And that criteria differs from school to school, honestly, because an array of factors goes into it in terms of like the evaluations that your doctors write about you, your test scores, any assignments, because you do have to write papers as well during your rotations. So the grades on those, and your small group participation. So all that stuff kind of is added together to make a grade, but that does vary from school to school. But yeah, so Cornell for the rotations or the clerkships does have honors, high pass, pass, fail. And I would say those grades are important for rotations in terms of showing proficiency and stuff.
So I'd love to speak a little bit about finding balance.
Yeah.
The infamous question. So have you found that you've had to make any sort of adjustments or sacrifices in terms of like your social schedule, your social life and self-care, especially with the rigorous schedule of medical school?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think for me, I always explain it that I think there's ebbs and flows. Like right now, for example, I actually feel like I have a much better work-life balance than my friends that are like working and are in corporate America, just because I have a lot of work from home and my own deadlines. But during rotations, your hours are long in terms of when you're studying and in the hospital. And I think honestly, finding a good social net, like social support, whether it's with your fellow classmates, which is great because they're all kind of going through it themselves and know how to support you best, or just like friends or loved ones. I think that's always really important. I know looking back, like my first 2 clerkship months, like I never really saw friends outside of medical school just because I didn't really have time. And even when I look back at photos from like those couple months, I'm like, oh, I didn't take care of myself as best as I should have. But I think it's just like you're constantly learning how to meet these new expectations. Kind of similar to when I was saying that there's like 3 phases. I think with each phase, you kind of have to like try and adapt to the new expectations in the new setting. And then sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. You have to like course correct, but that's like with anything else. I will say it's definitely possible to have a social life in medical school. I've been able to like travel with my classmates. I've made friends outside of school. I think it definitely depends on where your school is located. I live in New York, so there's definitely a lot of other young people. However, I know with people who may live in more like rural or suburban settings, they still like are able to make friends with other either like business school students, law school students, whatever. I think you're definitely able to have like a social life, if that's something that you prioritize. Let's see.
So there's a really great question in here.
Yeah. So this is a great question. This is honestly a very common interview question. So definitely for anyone, I'm not sure if anyone's in the interview stage at all over the next couple months, but it's definitely something that I would have like a drafted answer to. But for me, I think I always wanted like full autonomy in terms of the care of my patients. There are a lot of like similar roles, especially on your rotations, you'll see like PAs and Ps, they do really have very similar roles to physicians. But at the end of the day, they typically have to defer to a physician for treatment plans, and for some more complex like caretaking tools, in terms of like they're not able to necessarily be the primary caretaker for all patients. And for me, I knew I wanted full autonomy in terms of the care of the patient. Like I wanted to be kind of the primary point person, and that was something very important. And especially my clinical interests are in infertility care, and that's something where there's not really much room for other healthcare professionals in the same way a physician is, because you're both in the OR and in the clinic, and few other healthcare professions are able to do both. Nurses, NPs, and PAs can do surgery and clinic, but typically it's like one or the other. They're not necessarily splitting their time between two, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. A really great question. I want to be mindful of time, so maybe we can move on to the next section, which is about building mental resilience. Would you say, has there been a moment that really changed your perspective on resilience, mental health, self-care?
Yeah, so I will say, I feel like the toughest part of medical school so far is definitely just meeting new expectations. The stereotypical example of that is when you're in your surgery rotation, just like presenting yourself that you're like competent enough to be there, if that makes sense. Because a lot of surgeons, I don't know if you've heard, like, will ask you questions about the patient or the anatomy, and basically they will keep asking you questions until you get one wrong. That's kind of like the goal. It's kind of like an old-fashioned learning technique. But when you're meeting a surgeon for the first time, that can be very intimidating, especially if you get like the first one or two questions wrong. You're like, wow, I didn't make it that far. So I think something that builds resilience is like, even when you do have those off days where maybe you like broke, like you were scrubbed in, but like you became, I'm forgetting the word, but you're not sterile anymore by accident. Like you maybe touch something that isn't sterile, and you make like basically like a rookie mistake. I think just like going into the next surgery and just like starting fresh as if nothing had happened, because that's typically what surgeons want you to do. Just like act like every mistake that you made in the previous case, you're just going to learn from it and do better. I think honestly, on my surgery rotation, that was like the biggest thing. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but that's what came to mind.
It does. And what do you do to stay grounded in those moments where, like, let's say, either you, for example, or any sort of advice you have to pre-med students out there who are going through this? Because it's not easy to kind of compartmentalize all of that and just kind of move on to the next surgery or whatever the case may be. So how do you deal with that?
I think in the moment, honestly, when the day is just so busy and you just want to make the attendings you're working with happy, you just kind of keep pushing. And I know it depends on the person. Like for me, I'm not someone that necessarily needs to talk about my day when I come home. I actually want to do something completely different, like watch TV or something. Like I need like some time to just like lay for 30 minutes or so before I do whatever I need to do. Versus I know my roommates, they both like love like just telling their entire day, and they need to like kind of explain everything that happened. So I think just being able to push through that one day, and then at the end of the day, almost like having your stress relief, because you will have time to do that every day, even if it's just 30 minutes. I think just waiting for those pockets of time where you can just like relax or do whatever you need to do to relieve that stress is really important.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips on how to push through moments when you just feel too tired to study, but have to anyway in order to not fall behind with all the material? This is a really great question.
Yeah, I think for me, definitely social support. So at Cornell, all first-year students, or most first-year students, all live in the same building. So you really do have like a lot of bonding. And like I said, all first-year students take the same classes. So all the exams are at the same time and everything like that. So I think whenever I definitely was, especially if I'm studying in my room and like my bed is very close by, like I'll go to like my roommate's room because I live with two of my classmates, or I'll like go to like student lounge just because other people will also be working. And I feel like just by like osmosis or something, like that will make me do work as well. That being said, I do think that there's a time and place where if you need a break day, that's definitely allowed in medical school. It's not like we aren't machines if you do need breaks. So if you do really feel like, okay, like I need that extra hour of sleep tonight, or I need that extra hour of something tonight, and I've been productive like the last 6 days, I think it's very fair to say I won't fall behind if I just take a break for this one night, and then just modify your study schedule to adapt for that. I think that's also super important.
You got a thumbs up. Safe to say, I think you answered that one. Awesome. So I just want to do a quick check-in with everyone. We've been really great with all these questions and getting to them, so I don't want to spend too much time on the check-in. But yes, please get those questions in, whether it be about what it's like being in med school, whether it's about the MCAT, the admissions process. I think there's a lot that Alex can share. This is a really great question. I'd love to answer that or answer this. Would you say that med school is similar to pre-med and MCAT or more intense?
That's a great question. I think they're just very different. I think pre-med, at least in my experience, it felt more competitive than medical school, weirdly enough, in terms of competition between classmates, if that makes sense. The reason why I say that is because as a pre-med student, you have like maybe 500 kids in Orgo and they're all vying for spots in medical school, versus when you're in med school, there's like 20 different residency programs. So for example, even though my class is 85 kids, only 4 of us want to go into OBGYN. So it's kind of like you're only competing with like those 4 people, which I think made medical school better because you're not necessarily, you're not competing with everyone, because everyone has their own path and is kind of wants to do their own thing. I will say that MCAT is similar in terms of when you're studying for those board exams, which happen later on in your medical school career. It is very much like a numbers game too, unfortunately, where you're like constantly hoping to score a certain number and practice. And they actually give you blocks of time in medical school just to study for these exams. They give you 6 weeks like just to study and do well on this exam. So it kind of is like when you're hunkering down for the MCAT, it's very similar to that, I will say.
So there's another question in here about medical school lists. Do you want to answer that now or later on?
I can answer it, yeah. So what are your priorities when creating your medical school list? What made you pick Cornell? This is a great question. So I can tell you what I did versus like what I would do now, because I think they're a bit different. So when I was applying, I was still in college, and I went to college in North Carolina. So I went to college in a very college town. So I felt like I was open to kind of an array of settings. So I kind of applied all over the country, and really I was just looking to go to like the best school I could get into. Honestly, that was really just my end goal. And serendipitously, I got into Cornell, which is in New York City, and I think being in New York has like fundamentally affected my medical school career. I think I definitely have had some unconventional experiences just by the sheer fact of where I am, both in terms of patient interactions and like social and like life experiences. So I would say, and the reason why I say that is because when I first applied, I didn't really factor location at all. So I was like, I'm just trying to get the best education possible. I'll be in, a remote place need be. But I will say that if location is important to you, like if you do prioritize cities or you have family in certain areas, I would say listen to that. Because medical school is 4 years of your life and you're in your mid to late 20s or even older. And those times are important for social reasons and like life development reasons outside of medical school. So definitely be wise with your school list in terms of looking at where your scores line up and your GPA, etc. But also like listen to like where you also want to experience those 4 years. And also lastly is if there's certain patient populations that you're really interested in, urban patient populations, rural patient populations, that's also very important. The reason why I say that is being in New York, there's definitely certain specialties that are more focused on than others. So I'm interested in infertility care, which is very big in New York, and I've had a lot of great exposure clinically and research-wise. But I know I have friends that are interested in family medicine and primary care. And in New York, where everyone kind of has a specialty, because you kind of have to do that in a very competitive kind of city. I know my friends interested in family medicine and primary care haven't had the best exposure compared to maybe if they went somewhere more rural or suburban where primary care providers are more prevalent.
So I think we should save these questions maybe towards the end, but I would love to throw this out there because we have a few more sections to go. We on December 3rd, we actually have a webinar that is all about the med school selection process. So it's on our website. We highly recommend. Actually, it might not be on our website. Take that back. It will be on our website. If you're interested in getting an early invite, please send us an email and we'll make sure we get you on there. But that's exactly what it's about. It's all about the selection process, what you should consider. It'll be really detailed, so I highly encourage that. And then there's a question in the chat regarding personal essays. We have a ton of really great content on our website, including past webinars where Alex has actually been co-host and speaks all about the application process, including personal statements, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a ton of really great resources that we recommend you check out. So I'd love to chat about, so let's take a step back. We've talked about day in the life. We've talked a little bit about your routine. We've talked about building mental resilience and sort of what that could potentially look like. I'd love to talk about the memorable moments, the surprises, the things that you didn't necessarily know about the process. Was there, do you think, an aha moment or a moment where you were like, oh my gosh, this is what med school is really like?
Yeah, I think definitely when I was on my rotations and just seeing how much like you actually are part of the team. Like for some reason, it seems like you're always like studying, to get into medical school, but like you're never part of the actual clinical team. But when I started actually like writing notes for patients, or honestly, I think the biggest thing is when I was the person to wake my patients up first thing in the morning every day, and they kind of start to expect you to be there in the morning. That was very memorable to me, just because having that value on the clinical team is something that was really important. And I feel like that's really the essence of going to medicine and healthcare and being a medical student in general, like being able to be that point person for your patient.
And what about that really most surprised you? Like, what did you think it would be like versus what it actually was like, actually being there and feeling it and seeing it?
I'm trying to think. I don't know how to phrase it. But I think it ended up being a little less intimidating than I expected. Because I think when I hear about like residents and doctors, I think they're like so much older than me, and these like people that are like all knowing people. But once you start to get to know people and realize that they were in your shoes previously, and they almost like see you in that light as well, like knowing that you're going to be in their shoes one day, I think that made it a lot more relatable, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. Is there like what is sort of the most unexpected or a funny moment that sort of happened to you so far?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. I don't know about fun. I keep thinking of very like chaotic patient experiences that aren't, I don't know, necessarily like, I don't know, they're not very like funny, but they're just like, wow, that happens, I guess, if that makes sense. But basically there's this one patient, so you do an ED rotation. Sorry, someone's cleaning in the background if you hear a vacuum, but you do an ED rotation, so you're exposed to like a lot of different random scenarios that can happen, and you're just kind of like the helper in the ED wherever you can be. And there's this one person that was coming in from Queens that was working in a factory, and he actually had some kind of poisoning. We weren't sure what type, but he was very overheated. He had like a 104, 105 fever. Actually, I think it might have been higher. I think it was like 106. And my job was literally to get like buckets of ice and like pour it on him to like keep his body cool. So like for 30 minutes, I would just like fill up, if anyone's in the hospital, like the ice buckets, like I would just fill up and literally pour it on this person. And like while the ED staff was like actually triaging him. But that was something I just didn't expect I would ever be doing. Yeah.
And how did you handle that? Like, what was your mindset
Um,
in that moment?
I mean, I think in the moment you're just seeing everyone because everyone else, all the nurses and physicians are like managing his airway, like making sure he's like cardiovascularly like stable. So I think you just are like running off their energy, and then afterwards you're like, wait, what just happened? I think that's typically how it goes. Like, there's not really much thinking involved. You just like do what you're told and like just hope it kind of works out.
I'd love to throw in this question. I think a lot of us have seen, there's a ton of medical shows out there. We all know them: Grey's Anatomy, Chicago, I think it's Chicago MD, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think of those? How accurately does that even depict your own experiences? Is there any truth in it?
I'm sure there's like mild truth, definitely. I think the one thing is I feel like on those shows, the physicians always have like they seem to be doing like every single thing in the hospital at the same time. Like typically people are way more like niched down, like they do like one or two things and there's like way more people involved. Um, but I think there's some truth in terms of the work culture and like how like it's definitely in your residency program, you definitely get to know everyone really well. It's like a small program. And I think community is a big part of the medical school residency program. It's like such hard hours and you're all in the same setting. So I do think there is like, just like on those shows, I think there are strong bonds that are formed between people.
That's wonderful. There's some really awesome questions in the chat, so we'll make sure to get through as many of them as we can.
Yeah.
So let's talk about honest advice for med or future med students, I should say. What's sort of the real talk, for lack of a better word, that you'd share with someone thinking about med school? Something that maybe isn't in the brochures or something that you only learned from experience.
Yeah, so I definitely think something to, before you're even kind of applying, I definitely think you should make sure that medicine is definitely like the long-term investment that you want to do, if that makes sense. Because it is, I know when I was in college, I was like, oh, it's just like 4 more years of school, like it's fine. And at times, like it does just feel like, oh yeah, it is 4 more years, but at other times, I definitely am like, wow, this is 4 years I could have had like an income and a job, just like maybe some of the other people I graduated college with. So I think definitely from a financial standpoint, kind of knowing that it's definitely a investment in terms of your time, because medical school is expensive and just kind of figuring out that portion of it. But aside from that, I think if you really value clinical care and working with patients, it's a great experience to have. Yes.
That's wonderful, and I'd love to piggyback off of that a little bit. So what sort of skills and habits have turned out to be the most helpful for your success in med school?
I think scheduling and like time management for sure. I think you can definitely prioritize different things. Like you can prioritize your hobbies if you make time for them, if that makes sense. You can't necessarily do every single thing, but I know, for example, I have a friend that I go to medical school with that he really prioritizes dance. Like he's like a semi-professional dancer outside of medical school. So that's because he really times his like practices and his events and things like that. That means he might have to sacrifice some social life things or some other, factors. But that's something that's really important to him. So I think typically what I tell people is like, you can definitely do medical school and still have like one hobby that you're really invested in. It's just a matter of like where you find time for that hobby and prioritizing. And some people's hobby might just be like having a full social life and being able to like see friends every weekend or go out every weekend and stuff. Sometimes it's harder than others for sure, depending on what rotation you're on and stuff, and if you have a big exam. But I think there's room for life outside of medical school when you're in med school.
And I'd love to move on to the Q&A session soon, but is there anything that you'd like to share with us that maybe we haven't touched on?
I mean, I think just kind of similar to what I just said. I think especially the way like medical school is like perceived is like when you're in med school, like the only thing you can do is study. But I do think that it's important to like not just study, not even just for your own mental health, but just to develop as a person. Again, like everyone in medical school, like we're all still pretty young and we're all still like developing as a people. I think it's important to have experiences outside of studying and stuff, just to like one, like relate to your patients more, because as much as competency is important, making your patients feel comfortable is also really important. And sometimes just being able to have like great conversations with them or share life experiences with them is really what makes that difference. So I think making sure that, med school, definitely prioritize your studies, just like you would prioritize a job or a career, but also prioritize your own needs and wants. Because at the end of the day, it still is 4 years of your life that you're spending in school.
You got a little hand clap emoji. Hopefully you can see that. I just want to take a moment just to let our audience know, because I know you all see it on the screen. We would love to hear from you. So if you could take out your phones, take a minute, scan that QR code. It'll lead you back to a really short, it's only a few questions, I promise. It's just a feedback form. So we take all this feedback and we look to improve our process, right? Whether it's about a particular topic maybe you'd like to know more about, whether it's something you learned that was really interesting that you'd like us to maybe focus on for another webinar, or any sort of areas improvement. Obviously, all this information goes back to our team, and we roll with it. We take it and we make it better, and it allows us for better guidance in future sessions. The Q&A. Okay, so I know we're a little bit over time, but I'd love to spend maybe 5 minutes or so just getting through some of these final questions.
Yeah.
This individual says, you might have touched upon this earlier, but in terms of classes, what are labs like in med school? Are they similar or different to those you do as a pre-med?
Yeah, so the labs are actually pretty different. There's two main labs that you do, and they're mostly just anatomy focused. So your first semester of medical school, you do cadaver lab, which is basically where you dissect a human body. So typically what you would do is twice a week for about 2 to 3 hours for the first semester. At least the way my school did it is 4 people were assigned to like a cadaver, and you would dissect certain parts of the body depending on the week to kind of look at the anatomy of it and understand it. And then you're tested on the anatomy like the corresponding week. And then whenever you do your neural blocks, whenever you're looking your neuroscience block, your labs are actually like brain anatomy. So you're not necessarily dissecting the brain, but you'll have like brain slices that you'll look at just to understand the neuroanatomy. I would say the most hands-on lab is that first semester when you're doing anatomy. Aside from that, you're not necessarily doing like Gen Chem lab or bio lab or anything like that. Like you're not doing fruit flies, or you're not really working with beakers or anything like that. I think this question is good. Has there been moments when patient outcomes were not good? And how'd you deal with the situation? So definitely, I mean, it's part of medicine. I think it's definitely a rite of passage that during your clerkship year, you'll have patients that may pass away. And that happens to me several times. And I think that's a big part of, those are honestly the biggest bonding moments between the team. I've had like pediatric patients pass away, I've had older patients pass away, and I think you definitely deal with them differently. And I think in moments like that, you really should lean on your team attending, which is like the main doctor or at least your residents. Because typically it's not just you looking after a patient, it's at least 2 other people looking at it after a patient. So everyone knows how all the patients on the team are doing. So typically when there are bad outcomes, your more senior clinicians will either make the space open for if you need to talk about anything, but they also will just kind of talk through how to work through the grieving process as a clinician. Because that is definitely a major part of the job, especially if you want to go into certain fields like oncology or surgery. That's just nature of the job. And it's good to kind of be exposed to that in like a teaspoon sized amount as a med student, so you can kind of learn to work through that challenge. And then I see this question that says, have there been moments in med school where you had to deal with self-doubt or imposter syndrome? If there was, how do you get through it? Definitely. I don't know if there's anyone that doesn't have this. Especially I think in medical school, there's people that are I think all your classmates and everyone you work with will seem so accomplished, and almost you're confused, like, how did everyone get all this stuff done, in terms of like, how did they, like, how do I have classmates that know how to code really well, or somehow have all these other talents that I just never thought to know to do. And I think honestly, being open and honest about that is really important. Again, having a social network in medical school, you don't necessarily have to be best friends with everyone, but having 2 or 3 close friends that you really feel like you can like talk about these experiences with is really important, because you're definitely not alone in feeling that way. Definitely everyone has self-doubt. Even like the most, honestly, I think the brightest people I know are the people with the biggest imposter syndromes that it confuses me at times, because I'm like, to me, I'm like, they seem so confident and so able, yet they have doubt in themselves. So I think just being honest about it, communicating with your, like, either your close friends or your classmates, I think is really helpful to just push through it, knowing that you're not alone and feeling that way.
Beautiful. Okay, so I don't see any more questions in the chat. Thank you. I appreciate your honesty in choosing to share your experience.
Yeah, of course.
I think that is so perfectly said. So thank you, Alex. Thank you for your vulnerability, your transparency, your knowledge with us. Thank you to our audience for being here. I think this is a really great time to wrap up tonight's discussion, unless there's any more questions. So maybe I'll give everyone a minute to get in any sort of final thoughts, because I know we threw a lot at you. But Alex, if you could summarize medical school in one sentence, should we do one sentence or one word?
Yeah, I can answer this question. Do you have any experience with global health programs like Cornell? I haven't personally done them, but there are 2 options typically for global health programs at Cornell and most other medical schools that offer it. So contrary to college, I actually didn't mention this. The only summer that you have off is the summer after your first year, but aside from that, you're actually in school 12 months out of the year. Which at first I think sounds kind of crazy because you're so used to having summers off. However, when you have a job, you don't have summers off. So it's kind of is transitioning into making medicine a career. Like when you're a resident, you won't have summers off either. So it's actually a much easier transition than it sounds. But that being said, you can typically do a global health elective for 2 months the summer after your first year. So I know Cornell has a big program in India, in Tanzania, Thailand are like the 3 big countries you can work in, but there definitely are other satellite options. And then during your last year, you can do an international elective at an array of different countries across the world, ranging from 4 to 8 weeks. But that'll vary from school to school, but that's typically the 2 times you'll be able to do international healthcare. Because aside from that, you're pretty regimented in needing to be in the States.
Awesome. Okay, going back to my question.
Yeah.
You could wrap up your experiences in med school, 1 sentence.
Yeah. I would say like the days are long, but the months are fast. Like I think even during this like quote unquote slower part of medical school, when I think about like a month ago, it seems like so long ago. Well, actually it's the opposite, but it seems like it was just recently. But I think every day you just have like a long list of tasks to do. But then even for me now, the fact that I'm over halfway down seems crazy, and that I'm closer to residency than starting, like things like that. I think you'll never feel like you're like gonna be a grown-up doctor, but it actually like happens much quicker. Like now I have friends that are upperclassmen that are residents, and that in of itself feels weird. Nonetheless, like applying to match next year, which also seems crazy. So time really does fly by, despite having all these challenges and stuff along the way.
Beautifully said. Perfect time to end tonight's webinar. Thank you, audience. Again, Alex, thank you so much. We
of course.
loved having you here. And again, if you have any feedback for us, or if you have any suggestions for future webinars, please don't hesitate to reach out. We also have our consultations open for you. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.